These provisions aims at spoiling the stipulations which purpose is to elude tax by using legal constructions which, although apparently regular, do not translate the real character of the operations carried out. The questioning on sincerity of legal documents has, however, an exceptional character. And when the authorities want to restore the terms of the deeds with their real purpose, they must, of course, bring the proof of it. The law doesn't prohibit the taxpayer for choosing the legal framework who appears to him to be the most tax cost effective, but what is prohibited is the juridical dissimulation, the purely artificial juridical creation consisting in masking legal taxation. The article says, sorry, it's a translation from French. It's not. In order to give their real nature back, the tax authorities have the right to set aside as not being opposable the deeds constituent of an abuse of law, either that these deeds are fictitious or that they could be inspired by nothing else than to avoid or to attenuate the fiscal charges, which the taxpayer, if he had not passed or realized these deeds, would have really supported regarding his situation or his real activities. This text is relevant enough to understand that the general principle of fight against the abuse of law has a complex nature. This is why the jurisprudence has a large responsibility to define the limits of this theory. Few questions remain, however, unsolved because of the hesitations of the case law. As the question to know if the abuse of law applies in the presence of international treaties. Example with the case Bank of Scotland. The American pharmaceutical company Merrell Dow conclude in 1992 with a British banking institution, the company Bank of Scotland, a contract called usufruct agreement, by which it yielded to it for 3 years the usufruct of a little more than 17,000 shares with priority dividend without the right to vote, emitted for the occasion by its French subsidiary company with 99%, la Société Anonyme Marion Darrell Dow. The contract considered the payment to the bank of a predetermined annual dividend of 15 million euro. That is to say, 45 million euro after 3 years, and had several clauses to secure the bank against any risk or failure. In return of this transfer, the bank immediately paid the amount of 44.5 million euro to the American company. This scheme presented the interest to place the payments under Article 9 of the Franco-British Tax Treaty, which in particular allowed, at the time of the facts, the restitution of dividend tax credits to British residents, whereas the paid dividends to the American company did not open right to such a restitution. On the whole, the operation was a great opportunity for the American company because it enabled itself to make immediately go up 45 million euro dividends from its French subsidiary company with 0.5 million euro cost, whereas without this operation, it should have had to wait for several years before having this amount, decreased with a 5% deduction according to the Franco-American Treaty. The British Bank has for its own from the same excellent operation because in return to the 44.5 million euros advance granted to the American group, it could hope to also obtain an amount of more than 60 million euros, that is to say, the 45 million euro dividends, of course, decreased by a deduction of 15%, but to complete this point, also increased with 22.5 million tax credit. Then its net profit rose to more than 60 million euros on the whole, including the 0.5 million euro commission paid by the American company and the 15.8 million euro supported by the French Treasury. Warned by the IRS American, the French tax authorities had promptly reacted. In this case, estimating themselves there could be an obvious case of treaty shopping, the French tax administration has expressed an opposition to the request of refunding presented by the British Bank. The authorities have made an application of the abuse of law theory, considering that the usufruct agreement concluded with the American company could be looked as dissimulating a loan, and then the British Bank could not be the effective owner of the dividends. To close this chapter, it should be recalled. You can see now the normal situation without the abuse of law. To close this chapter, it should be recalled that the abuse of law constitutes a weapon whose tax authorities could themselves try to misuse. The broad definition of the abuse of law's criteria can also suppose that certain arbitrary can prevail on the need for respecting a minimum of legal security. This is why the taxpayer who has to face this procedure can seize an independent commission which will examine his case and will deliver an opinion, which is certainly an advice, but to which, in the majority of cases, the authorities line up. Back to my introductory subjects, I would say that if the theory of the abuse of law reveals that the special tax norm cannot be always sufficient by itself, it also teaches that all what can be envisaged in advance has preferably to be done by a legislative way. For many authors, the dissolution of the legal rule in general principles must thus be avoided as much as possible. Is it thus necessary to be resigned to oscillate between two poles, the rule of strict application and the principles of generic application, knowing that none of both gives satisfaction with regard to the basic principles of the juridical order? Defiantly, the history of the fight against tax avoidance is not finished. It is possible that the oscillations of the legal standard opens the way to other forms of regulation, emanating no longer from the legislator, but from the economic actors themselves. The idea of social responsibility of companies carries out us towards a second phase of the marginalization of the legal rule. It is what could be called the regulation by the external pressure. In France, like elsewhere, the social responsibility of the companies is soon expected to have a short impact on their tax behaviors. Firstly, because of the economic situation. The recent financial crisis highlighted certain dysfunctions of the financial system, to which French public opinion is extremely sensitive. The opposition against the tax havens illustrates this phenomenon. And furthermore, the non-budgetary objectives of taxation tend to take a central place in the public discussion. In France, the debates on taxation of the financial institutions' profits or on the difference between the taxation of incomes coming from labor and those resulting from assets particularly demonstrate them amongst others. Secondly, because of certain recent scandals, tax decisions have a growing impact on the image and external communication of the companies. In France, certain publications stigmatize the deviating tax practices in the name of a certain idea of a good governance for trading activities. If this trend to the intensification of the social risk control on businesses is confirmed, the first effect to be expected would be a reinforcement of companies' obligations on transparency for their tax behaviors. Today, there does not exist in France any general obligation for tax information, disclosure for company. In the same way, tax lawyers are not legally bound to disclose their tax avoidance schemes, which they propose to their customers, to tax authorities. Also, several tax projects inspired by English or American devices were conceived by tax authorities to introduce in France transparency obligations. These attempts unfortunately happened to fail because of the strong resistance of professional environments. Thanks.